Tonight's story comes from many hours of careful research and quiet dedication. Each detail was chosen with purpose, to create a peaceful listening experience and to respectfully present the events being told. This channel exists to bring attention to cases that time almost allowed to disappear. In the spring of 2004, Port Salerno, Florida became the hunting ground for Eugene Wayman McQuatters Jr., who would attack several homeless women over a deadly 10-week period. 3 women would not survive their encounters with the man investigators would call the Solerno Strangler. Welcome to True Crime Headquarters. This evening, we uncover some disturbing cases where the truth lurked far beneath a harmless surface. Now, please take a moment to settle in. Breathe slowly. Let the outside world fade. This is the story, the Solerno Strangler. When Port Salerno's shadows concealed a predator. Now let's begin. This is the story of how a small Florida community's most vulnerable became prey, how a pattern of violence nearly went undetected among the marginalized, and how one man's injury during his final attack would become the thread that unraveled everything. It's an examination of justice delayed, lives lost, and the women whose names deserve to be remembered. Jackie Bradley, Crystal Wiggins, and Carrie and Coey. Please, if you enjoy listening and would like to find this channel again, you're welcome to subscribe. The year 2004 arrived in Port Salerno much like any other. This small community in Martin County, Florida, sat tucked along the southeastern coast, a place where waterways carved through neighborhoods and palm trees swayed in subtropical breezes. But beneath the surface calm, a dangerous pattern was beginning to take shape. Eugene McQuatters had a history that preceded the murders, dropping out of high school due to drug problems, struggling to maintain employment. His past contained warning signs that the system had failed to adequately address. In January 1998, he faced charges for aggravated battery against a teenage boy, serving only 7 months before release on probation. 3 years later, he injured his girlfriend's father with a gun, but served just 3 months for probation violation. These incidents painted a picture of escalating violence, yet McQuatters remained largely unsupervised in the community. He moved between locations, sometimes staying at campsites where Port Salerno's homeless population gathered, other times with relatives. This transient lifestyle would later prove crucial to understanding how he selected his victims. The attacks began before the murders. On December 15, 2003, McQuatters sexually assaulted a homeless woman at a campsite in Golden Gate. The victim, trapped in circumstances that often prevent reporting, never contacted police. That assault represented a critical missed opportunity, a chance to stop McQuatters before he escalated to murder. 4 months later, on March 24, 2004, McQuatters encountered 43-year-old Jackie Bradley. She had spent years navigating the difficult terrain of homelessness, finding temporary shelter where she could, including at the campsite where McQuatters occasionally stayed. On March 28, witnesses including Thomas Field, Austin Cottle Sr., and Terry McElroy observed Bradley spending the afternoon at the campsite, drinking and talking with others. Before dark, McQuatters joined the group and was overheard offering Bradley the use of his cousin's house so she could bathe. It was a seemingly kind gesture that concealed terrible intentions. Field and McElroy watched as Bradley and McQuatters left the campsite together. It would be the last time anyone saw Jackie Bradley alive. What happened next remains known only through forensic evidence and McQuatters' later confession. The promised shower became an assault. Bradley resisted, but McQuatters overpowered her. He sexually assaulted and strangled her to death, then disposed of her body in a ditch filled with shallow water, attempting to conceal it under rocks. 3 days passed before a jogger discovered Bradley's body on March 31st. The location was a canal connecting 2 ponds, just 100 feet from McQuatters' cousin's street. She was found wearing a t-shirt and bra bunched up to her armpits, with other clothing scattered nearby. The Martin County Sheriff's Office launched an investigation. Medical examination revealed the cause of death: manual strangulation. The attack had been vicious and prolonged. Dr. Roger Middleman, conducting the autopsy, noted injuries consistent with sexual assault preceding the murder. Investigators learned that McQuatters had been identified as the last person seen with Bradley. Yet remarkably, police did not immediately seek to question him. This decision would have devastating consequences. Spring moved into early summer. Port Salerno's homeless community remained unaware that one of their own had become a predator. McQuatters continued moving through familiar circles, offering drugs, alcohol, and companionship to women whose survival often depended on such transactions. Memorial Day weekend 2004 brought unseasonably warm weather to Florida's Treasure Coast. On the Sunday of that weekend, several people including Joseph Herbert, Cindy Lynn Kaman, Crystal Wiggins, and McQuatters gathered at Donna Nicholson's house. The group spent the evening socializing, the atmosphere likely relaxed despite the difficult circumstances most of them faced daily. Late that night, between 9:00 p.m. and midnight, Herbert suggested the group go to his hotel room, but McQuatters was not invited. 29-year-old Crystal Wiggins chose to stay behind with him. As the others departed, Herbert saw Wiggins and McQuatters walking toward the Lil Saints store. When the group returned from Herbert's hotel 45 to an hour later, both McQuatters and Wiggins were gone. Nobody thought much of it at the time. People in their community came and went constantly, following opportunities for drugs, shelter, or work. But Crystal Wiggins would never return. Somewhere in the darkness of that Memorial Day evening, McQuatters lured her to an isolated location. He strangled her to death and dumped her body in a pile of brush. The horror compounded itself within hours. Early Monday morning, 18-year-old Carrie and Coe was also in the Port Salerno area. She had been seen smoking crack cocaine with a man at the Heritage Inn in Hobe Sound. Jerry Arthur Pravat confirmed he had used drugs with Coe in his room between Sunday night and Monday morning. At approximately 2:45 or 3 a.m., Pravat dropped Coe off at the Lil Saints parking lot, the same location where McQuatters had been seen with Wiggins just hours earlier. Pravat saw McQuatters approach Coe, and that was the last time anyone saw her alive. Carrie and Coe was barely an adult, her entire life ahead of her. Like Wiggins and Bradley before her, she existed in society's margins, where visibility is low and protection nearly non-existent. McQuatters recognized this vulnerability and exploited it ruthlessly. He approached her with the promise of drugs. In her circumstances, such offers represented currency, a means of getting through another difficult night. She had no reason to suspect the man who greeted her was responsible for a murder committed just hours earlier, or that she would become his third victim. The attack followed the same pattern. McQuatters led Coe to an isolated wooded area. He sexually assaulted her, then strangled her. He attempted to cover her body with branches but accidentally tripped and broke his foot during the process. This injury, painful, debilitating, impossible to conceal, would ultimately lead investigators directly to him. For 4 days, both bodies remained undiscovered. On June 3, 2004, Carrie and Coe's body was found in a wooded area near Lincoln Street. She was nude from the waist down, her shirt and bathing suit top pushed up into the armpit area, covered in dead vegetation and vines. The positioning was disturbingly similar to how Jackie Bradley had been found. Medical examination determined Coe had died by manual strangulation, and her body had been decomposing for approximately 4 days. 4 days later, on June 7, 2004, Crystal Wiggins' body was discovered. Her shirt and bra were pulled up toward her neck, matching the pattern seen with the other victims. The medical examiner concluded her death resulted from asphyxia by manual strangulation, and she was likely a victim of sexual assault. 3 women, 3 murders, all within approximately 10 weeks, all sharing the same cause of death, the same pattern of sexual assault, the same attempts at concealment. The Martin County Sheriff's Office now understood they were hunting a serial killer. The discovery of Wiggins' body on June 7th transformed what had been separate investigations into a coordinated manhunt. Detectives recognized the unmistakable signature. Vulnerable women from the homeless community, sexually assaulted, manually strangled, bodies positioned similarly and concealed in isolated locations. Detective work in such cases often depends on witness cooperation, but investigating crimes against the homeless presents unique challenges. Many witnesses live transient lives, moving between campsites, motels, and temporary shelters. Some distrust law enforcement due to past experiences. Others fear retaliation or simply want to avoid involvement with police. Despite these obstacles, investigators began piecing together timelines. They interviewed people who had seen the victims in their final hours, mapped locations where bodies were found, and searched for connections between the crime scenes. The break came from an unexpected source: medical records. Detectives discovered that McQuatters had been treated at a hospital after breaking his foot. The timing aligned perfectly with when Coey had been killed. A convenience store clerk verified that McQuatters showed up with a limp at 7 a.m. on the day of the murders, bought beer, then returned 3 hours later. Meanwhile, another piece of the puzzle emerged. The woman McQuatters had sexually assaulted in December 2003 came forward. Perhaps emboldened by news coverage of the murders, or perhaps finally feeling safe enough to report, she contacted investigators. She identified McQuatters in a photo lineup. The evidence was circumstantial but mounting. Last seen with victims, unexplained injury matching the timeline, positive identification by a previous assault victim, and a criminal history including violence. Detectives had their suspect. On June 23, 2004, Eugene McQuatters was arrested. Initially detained on an unrelated sexual battery charge, he soon found himself facing questions about 3 murders. The interrogation room became a space where investigators sought to understand not just what happened, but why. McQuatters was advised of his Miranda rights and questioned by detectives about the deaths of Bradley, Wiggins, and Coey. During interviews on June 7 and June 18, 2004, McQuatters denied any involvement in the murders. He maintained this position until June 23, when after being arrested on the unrelated charge and interviewed again, he confessed to killing all 3 women. The confession provided disturbing details. McQuatters stated it was a mystery why he killed the 3 women. Regarding Bradley, he said he offered her the use of his sister's shower and walked her to the house, taking her because the opportunity presented itself. He acknowledged it was possible he choked Bradley, saying it happened by a banana tree around 11:30 p.m. He described walking along the canal bank with Bradley, attempting to have sex with her, noting she resisted at first, but then they had intercourse. Afterward, he claimed he saw what he had done but was unsure how it happened. Then put her in the water, threw her clothes in, and placed rocks on top while trying to hide that bitch. The language revealed callousness, a dehumanization of his victim that allowed him to commit and then discuss horrific acts with disturbing detachment. Regarding Carrie and Coey, McQuatters stated she was looking for drugs and he had some. He saw her exit Pravat's vehicle on Lincoln Street, approached her, and told her about his drugs. He began having sex with her at the end of Lincoln Street, noting Wiggins was already dead by then, but it was the same night. He said he was responsible for Coey's death, although he could not describe how it happened, and that he put her in the trees trying to cover her up. McQuatters admitted to hiding all 3 bodies because he knew what he had done and knew it was wrong. This acknowledgement would later prove significant during trial, undermining any potential insanity defense. However, confessions in criminal cases are complex. McQuatters later recanted his confession, setting up what would become a contentious legal battle about the voluntariness and reliability of his statements to police. The confession, whether ultimately admissible or not, had given investigators detailed knowledge about the crimes. They understood the sequence of events, the locations, the methods. They knew they were dealing with someone who selected vulnerable victims, used promises of drugs or shelter as lures, then committed sexual assault followed by murder. The forensic evidence presented its own narrative. Dr. Roger Middleman, the medical examiner, conducted thorough autopsies on all 3 victims. The findings were consistent across cases. For Jackie Bradley, examination revealed injuries indicating both sexual assault and manual strangulation. The hyoid bone and other neck structures showed damage consistent with sustained compression. Dr. Middleman explained that manual strangulation could cause loss of consciousness within 20 to 30 seconds, but death required maintaining pressure for approximately 3 minutes, a deliberate, prolonged act. Similar findings emerged from Wiggins and Coey's autopsies. Both showed signs consistent with sexual assault or attempted sexual assault. Both died from asphyxiation caused by manual strangulation. The pattern was unmistakable, yet challenges remained. No forensic evidence directly linked McQuatters to the 3 homicides. The bodies had been exposed to elements for days before discovery, compromising potential DNA evidence. Sexual assault kits yielded no results due to extreme decomposition. The prosecution's case would rest heavily on circumstantial evidence. Witness testimony placing McQuatters with victims shortly before their deaths, his injured foot matching the timeline, his knowledge of details only the killer would know, and his confession, if it could be admitted. The defense would argue the confession was coerced or unreliable, that McQuatters confessed because he enjoyed attention, and that without physical evidence, the state could not prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt. As the case moved toward trial, the community grappled with difficult questions. How had 3 women been murdered in such a small area over such a short time without anyone recognizing the pattern earlier? Why had McQuatters not been questioned immediately after Bradley's murder when witnesses placed him with her? The answers pointed to uncomfortable truths about how society views and protects its most vulnerable members. Crimes against homeless individuals often receive less attention, fewer resources, slower responses. Victims who engage in sex work or drug use are sometimes deemed less credible, their cases less urgent. Jackie Bradley, Crystal Wiggins, and Carrie and Coey deserved better. They deserved protection they never received, justice that came too late, and recognition as human beings whose lives mattered. The legal system would now attempt to provide that justice, however belatedly. The trial began in September 2006, more than 2 years after McQuatters' arrest. The courtroom became a space where prosecutors and defense attorneys presented competing narratives about what happened during those 10 terrible weeks in Port Salerno. The state's case, presented by experienced prosecutors, painted McQuatters as a calculating predator. They argued he was a calculating killer who lured victims with promises of drugs and alcohol, and that he remembered everything. This characterization was crucial. It established premeditation, intent, and awareness, all elements necessary for first-degree murder convictions. Evidence presented to the jury included testimony from multiple witnesses. Thomas Field, Austin Cottle Sr., and Terry McElroy described seeing Bradley with McQuatters on the evening she disappeared. Their accounts established timeline and opportunity. Joseph Herbert and Cindy Lynn come on testified about the Memorial Day weekend gathering, describing how Wiggins stayed behind with McQuatters when others left for Herbert's hotel room. Jerry Pravat recounted dropping Coey at the Lil Saints parking lot in the early morning hours and watching McQuatters approach her. Medical examiners presented forensic findings. Dr. Middleman walked jurors through autopsy results, explaining the mechanics of manual strangulation, the time required to cause death, the injuries found on each victim. These clinical descriptions, while difficult to hear, established cause of death and patterns consistent with serial murder. The broken foot became a key piece of circumstantial evidence. Dr. Lillian Avner, an emergency room physician, testified she treated McQuatters around 8:35 a.m. on May 31, 2004, for a broken ankle. She noted he had no strong odor of alcohol and was alert and oriented normally. The timing placed his injury within hours of when Coey was killed, and McQuatters himself had mentioned injuring his foot while disposing of her body. The most controversial element was McQuatters' confession. Prosecutors sought to introduce his detailed admissions about all 3 murders, arguing they contained information only the killer could know and were given voluntarily after proper Miranda warnings. The defense challenged this vigorously. McQuatters' attorneys claimed he only confessed because he enjoyed attention, but that he didn't actually kill any of the victims. They argued his statements were unreliable, possibly coerced, and should not be considered credible evidence. Legal arguments about the confession consumed significant court time. Defense attorneys examined the interrogation techniques used, the length of questioning, whether McQuatters truly understood his rights, and whether his mental state allowed for voluntary waiver of those rights. The prosecution countered that McQuatters had been properly advised of his rights, that he waived them knowingly, and that his confession matched physical evidence and witness testimony. They noted he had asked intelligent questions during interrogation, including whether he would receive the death penalty, demonstrating awareness and understanding. Beyond the confession debate, the trial explored McQuatters' background. Evidence emerged about his troubled history, including substance abuse, prior violent crimes, and unstable living situation. The prosecution used this to establish pattern and propensity. The defense attempted to present mitigating factors. Defense witnesses testified about abuse McQuatters had experienced, attempting to provide context for his behavior without excusing it. However, the prosecution's rebuttal was devastating. Regardless of his past, McQuatters had made conscious choices to assault and murder 3 women. Expert testimony addressed McQuatters' mental state. Experts concluded McQuatters did not have a mental disorder preventing him from distinguishing right from wrong. This undermined any potential insanity defense and reinforced the prosecution's argument that these were deliberate, calculated acts. The trial also addressed whether the 3 cases should be tried together or separately. The court granted the state's Williams Rule motion, allowing the cases to be consolidated. This meant jurors heard evidence about all 3 murders simultaneously, allowing them to see the pattern and signature elements connecting the crimes. Defense attorneys had argued for separate trials, suggesting the cumulative effect of hearing about 3 murders would prejudice the jury. The court disagreed, finding that the crimes were sufficiently similar and connected to warrant joint consideration. Throughout the proceedings, family members of the victims attended when possible. Bearing witness to the legal process meant to hold McQuatters accountable. Their presence served as a reminder that beyond legal arguments and procedural debates, real people had died, leaving behind loved ones seeking justice and closure. The jury deliberated after hearing weeks of testimony and examining extensive evidence. They had to weigh witness credibility, assess forensic findings, determine whether the confession was reliable, and ultimately decide whether the prosecution had proven guilt beyond reasonable doubt. McQuatters was found guilty and sentenced to death on December 4, 2006. The jury had concluded the evidence, circumstantial though much of it was, pointed unmistakably to McQuatters as the person responsible for all 3 murders. The sentencing phase allowed both sides to present additional evidence. Prosecutors argued for death, citing the heinous nature of the crimes, multiple victims, sexual assault accompanying the murders, and lack of genuine remorse. Defense attorneys pleaded for mercy, presenting mitigating evidence about McQuatters' difficult background and arguing against capital punishment. The judge ordered that McQuatters also serve 3 consecutive life prison terms for the sexual assaults and be chemically castrated if he met medical criteria. For the next 8 years, McQuatters remained on Florida's death row awaiting execution. During this time, his attorneys pursued appeals, challenging various aspects of the trial and conviction. Appeals in death penalty cases are extensive and time-consuming, examining every procedural detail, every ruling, every piece of admitted or excluded evidence. McQuatters' attorneys raised numerous issues on appeal, including questions about the admissibility of evidence, effectiveness of trial counsel, jury instructions, and application of aggravating factors. Then came a significant development. In 2014, a judge awarded McQuatters a new trial, finding that his original defense team had performed inadequately. Specifically, the ruling stated his trial counsel provided ineffective assistance by failing to adequately challenge DNA evidence and other prosecution elements during the penalty phase. This decision vacated the death sentences, not the convictions themselves, but the punishment. McQuatters would face a new trial, potentially resulting in another death sentence or possibly life imprisonment. As the retrial date approached in April 2015, both sides prepared to present their cases again. Witnesses would be recalled, evidence re-examined, arguments rehearsed. For the victims' families, it meant reliving the trauma of the original trial. But the retrial never happened. On April 10, 2015, Eugene McQuatters entered a no-contest plea to 3 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of Jackie Bradley, Crystal Wiggins, and Carrie Coe. The plea came hours before jury selection for his retrial was scheduled to begin. A no-contest plea differs from a guilty plea in important ways. By pleading no contest, McQuatters did not admit guilt but acknowledged the state had sufficient evidence to convict. This legal distinction mattered less to most observers than the practical outcome. He would be held accountable without forcing victims' families through another trial. Circuit Judge Sherwood Coleman imposed 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, guaranteeing McQuatters permanent incarceration and foreclosing any future release. Defense attorney Michael Salnick indicated that McQuatters opted for the plea to mitigate the risk of reconviction and another death sentence, which would have triggered extended appellate reviews potentially lasting decades. From a strategic standpoint, the plea represented certainty over the unknown outcome of a retrial. For prosecutors, the plea ensured justice without the expense and uncertainty of another lengthy trial. For families, it meant closure without enduring another emotionally devastating court proceeding. For the public, it meant a serial killer would spend the remainder of his life in prison without possibility of release. Eugene McQuatters died in prison in 2024, ending a life that caused immeasurable harm to multiple women and their loved ones. The McQuatters case raises important questions about how society responds to crimes against vulnerable populations. All 3 victims, Bradley, Wiggins, and Coe, lived on society's margins. They struggled with homelessness, substance abuse, and survival sex work. These circumstances made them vulnerable to predation and often meant their cases received less attention than crimes against more privileged victims. Consider the timeline. Jackie Bradley was murdered on March 24, 2004. Witnesses placed McQuatters with her immediately before her disappearance. Her body was found March 31st. Yet police did not question McQuatters until weeks later, after 2 more women had been killed. Why the delay? The answer likely involves resource allocation, investigative priorities, and unconscious biases about which victims merit urgent attention. If Bradley had been a middle-class woman living in a suburban home, would the response have been different? The question is uncomfortable but necessary. The case also highlights the missing phenomenon. Individuals whose disappearances go unreported because they lack stable housing, regular employment, or consistent social connections. Bradley, Wiggins, and Coe could have vanished without anyone filing official missing persons reports. Their bodies were discovered by chance by joggers and passersby, not through organized searches. McQuatters understood this dynamic and exploited it. He selected victims whose circumstances provided him cover. Women who might not be immediately missed. Women whose lifestyle choices might cause authorities to delay or deprioritize investigations. Women whose deaths might be attributed to overdoses, accidents, or the general dangers of street life rather than recognized as homicides. This targeting of vulnerable victims is common among serial killers. From Robert Pickton in Vancouver, who murdered sex workers for years before being caught, to Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, who specifically chose women he believed wouldn't be missed. Predators recognize and exploit social marginalization. The McQuatters case demonstrates why robust, immediate responses to all missing persons and suspicious deaths matter, regardless of the victim's circumstances. Every person deserves protection, investigation, and justice. It's also worth examining the systemic failures that allowed McQuatters to reach the point of committing murder. His criminal history included violent offenses, battery of a teenager, assault with a firearm. Yet he served minimal time and received little supervision upon release. Probation violations resulted in brief incarcerations rather than meaningful intervention. Could better oversight, more effective probation monitoring, or mandatory treatment for substance abuse and violent tendencies have prevented the murders? We cannot know with certainty, but the pattern suggests opportunities for intervention were missed. The confession issue deserves consideration as well. McQuatters confessed, recanted, then ultimately accepted responsibility through his no-contest plea. The legal battles over admissibility of his statements reflect ongoing debates about interrogation techniques, voluntariness, and reliability. Confessions remain controversial in criminal justice. While they can provide crucial evidence, concerns about false confessions and coercive interrogation techniques are well documented. The McQuatters case illustrates why courts carefully scrutinize confessions while also showing how confessions containing verifiable details unknown to the public can significantly strengthen prosecutions. The forensic limitations in this case, decomposition preventing DNA recovery, lack of physical evidence directly linking McQuatters to crimes, demonstrate both how far forensic science has come and its continuing limitations. Modern investigators rely heavily on DNA evidence, but in cases where bodies are not discovered immediately or where evidence is compromised, prosecutions must proceed on circumstantial evidence and witness testimony. The jury in McQuatters' original trial convicted based on such circumstantial evidence. Witnesses placing him with victims, his injured foot, his confession, and the pattern across 3 murders. This underscores that circumstantial evidence, when it accumulates and points consistently toward guilt, can sustain convictions even without direct physical evidence. For the families of Jackie Bradley, Crystal Wiggins, and Carrie and Coe, the legal proceedings, initial trial, appeals, retrial preparation, and final plea stretched across more than a decade. This is not unusual in capital cases, where appeals are extensive and thorough, but it represents years of unresolved grief and trauma. The women themselves deserve to be remembered not primarily as victims, but as individuals with their own stories, struggles, and humanity. Jackie Bradley at 43 had lived a full life before encountering McQuatters. Crystal Wiggins at 29 was in the prime of adulthood. Carrie and Coe at 18 had barely begun her adult life. Their struggles with homelessness and addiction were part of their stories but did not define their worth as human beings. They deserved safety, support, and the opportunity to overcome their challenges. Instead, they encountered a predator who saw their vulnerability as opportunity. The Port Salerno community had to reckon with the reality that a serial killer had operated among them, targeting their most vulnerable members. Small communities often believe themselves immune to such horrors, associating serial murder with large urban areas. The McQuatters case demonstrated that predators can emerge anywhere, particularly where oversight is limited and potential victims are marginalized. In the years since these crimes, conversations about protecting vulnerable populations have evolved. Law enforcement agencies have developed better protocols for investigating crimes against sex workers and homeless individuals. Advocacy groups work to ensure missing persons cases receive appropriate attention regardless of the victim's circumstances. The awareness movements and increased consciousness about violence against women have created space for discussions about how society responds to such crimes. While progress remains incomplete and uneven, there is growing recognition that all victims deserve equal protection and justice. The McQuatters case also intersects with debates about capital punishment. He was initially sentenced to death, a sentence later vacated, then avoided in the plea agreement. His ultimate death in prison from natural causes rendered moot the question of whether the state should have executed him. For some, his life sentence represented appropriate justice, permanent incarceration ensuring public safety without the state taking a life. For others, the death penalty would have been fitting punishment for the murder of 3 women. These perspectives reflect broader societal divisions about capital punishment's morality and effectiveness. What remains indisputable is that Eugene McQuatters committed terrible crimes against 3 women who deserved to live, who deserved protection they never received, and who deserved justice that came too slowly. Their names, Jackie Bradley, Crystal Wiggins, Carrie and Coe, should be remembered. Their lives mattered. Their deaths demanded accountability. And their stories should inform ongoing efforts to protect the vulnerable and ensure equal justice regardless of circumstance. The case of the Solerno Strangler is closed. Eugene McQuatters died in prison, never to harm anyone again. But the lessons from Port Salerno in 2004 remain relevant. Society must protect all its members, investigators must pursue all cases with equal vigor, and justice must be accessible to everyone, regardless of where they sleep, how they survive, or what struggles they face. In remembering this case, we honor not the killer but his victims. We acknowledge the failures that allowed the crimes to occur, and we commit to doing better for those who, like Bradley, Wiggins, and Coe, live in circumstances that make them vulnerable to predation. That is the true legacy of this case. Not the name of a murderer, but the memory of 3 women and the ongoing work to ensure no one else suffers their fate. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. The Beast of Houston. Jose Medellin and the Night That Shattered Innocence. AKA El Depredador de la Noche, the Night Predator. On a sweltering June evening in 1993, 2 teenage girls walked into the darkness of a Houston park and never walked out, their final moments orchestrated by a predator who believed the shadows belonged to him. What began as laughter between friends ended in a symphony of unspeakable violence. A crime so methodical, so devoid of humanity, that it would force a nation to confront the darkest capacities of the human soul. This is the story of Jose Medellin, a man whose name became synonymous with calculated brutality, and the June night when evil wore the face of familiar neighborhood boys. Before we descend into the abyss of what transpired, understand this. What you're about to hear isn't merely a recounting of tragedy. It's a journey into the mechanics of malice, the psychology of pack mentality, and the devastating moment when childhood innocence collided with predatory intent. The events that unfolded didn't just claim 2 young lives. They revealed how quickly civilization's veneer can shatter, exposing the savage impulses that lurk beneath. This case would ignite international controversy, challenge diplomatic relations between nations, and ultimately ask a question that still haunts us. How do we reconcile justice with mercy when confronted with the irredeemable? Houston's summer nights carried a particular quality in 1993, thick with humidity, alive with the chorus of cicadas, and pregnant with possibility for teenagers seeking escape from cramped apartments and watchful parents. The city's northeastern neighborhoods pulsed with the energy of working-class families, recent immigrants, and young people navigating the complicated terrain between adolescence and adulthood. TC. Jester Park sat like an urban oasis amid the concrete sprawl, a place where during daylight hours children played and families gathered. But after sunset, it transformed into something altogether different, a threshold between the illuminated world and the unknown. Jennifer Ertman, 14 years old, embodied the kind of vibrant spirit that made her impossible to overlook. Her laughter carried across rooms, her confidence radiated in the way she walked, and her friendship with Elizabeth Pena ran deep as the roots of the oak trees that lined their neighborhood streets. Elizabeth, 16, possessed a maturity beyond her years, a young woman caught in that liminal space between girlhood and the responsibilities that awaited her. The two had spent that evening of June 24th doing what teenagers have done since time immemorial. Talking, dreaming, sharing secrets that felt monumental in their private universe. The party they'd attended ran later than anticipated. As the clock approached 11, both girls knew they'd crossed into territory that would invite parental disapproval. The decision they made next would become the pivot point upon which everything turned. Rather than take the longer, well-lit route home, they chose the shortcut through TC Jester Park. It was a path they'd traveled before, a route that would shave precious minutes off their journey and perhaps minimize the consequences awaiting them. They couldn't have known that, on this particular night, the park harbored predators. Jose Medellin had turned 18 just weeks earlier, but his childhood had been carved from harder stone than most. Born across the border in Mexico, he'd navigated the complexities of immigrant life in a city that could be welcoming and hostile in equal measure. He'd gravitated toward a group that called themselves a gang, young men seeking identity, power, and belonging in a world that often made them feel invisible. On this June evening, Medellin and 5 others had gathered for an initiation ritual, a grotesque ceremony designed to bind new members to their collective through violence and degradation. The group had already assaulted one young woman earlier in the evening, a horrifying prelude to what would come. They'd been drinking, their inhibitions dissolved, their capacity for cruelty amplified by alcohol and the dangerous psychology of group dynamics. When Jennifer and Elizabeth emerged from the tree line into the clearing where these 6 young men had congregated, fate sealed itself with terrible finality. What transpired in those initial moments remains chilling in its casualness. The girls weren't random targets selected from a distance. They walked directly into the predator's midst, their shortcut intersecting with evil's coordinates. Medellin and his companions didn't hesitate. The transition from encounter to attack happened with horrifying speed, the girls' confusion transforming into terror as they realized the danger surrounding them. The assault began with physical restraint. Hands grabbing, voices shouting, the girls' protests drowned by the malicious excitement of their attackers. Jennifer and Elizabeth fought with every ounce of strength their young bodies possessed, but they were catastrophically outnumbered. 6 against 2. Darkness against innocence. Predatory intent against desperate survival instinct. Medellin emerged as a primary orchestrator of what followed. Witnesses would later describe his demeanor as chillingly calm, his actions methodical rather than frenzied. He didn't just participate in the violence. He directed it, ensuring each member of the group took part in the degradation of these 2 terrified children. The assault wasn't merely physical violation. It was systematic dehumanization, a deliberate stripping away of dignity, autonomy, and hope. The brutality lasted over an hour. Jennifer and Elizabeth endured violations that language struggles to adequately capture. Repeated sexual assaults by multiple attackers, physical beatings that left their bodies battered and broken, psychological torture as they begged for mercy that would never arrive. The men took turns, encouraged one another, laughed at the girls' suffering. The initiation ritual they'd planned found its most depraved expression in the complete domination of these 2 defenseless teenagers. But Medellin and his accomplices faced a problem that countless perpetrators before them had confronted. Witnesses. Jennifer and Elizabeth had seen their faces, could identify them, represented the possibility of consequences. The decision to murder the girls wasn't made in a moment of passion or panic. It was calculated, discussed among the group, agreed upon collectively. They would eliminate the evidence of their crimes by eliminating the victims themselves. The methodology of murder revealed depths of cruelty that shocked even hardened investigators. Rather than quick executions, the killers chose strangulation, a method requiring sustained physical effort, prolonged contact, and the unavoidable awareness of life ebbing away beneath their hands. They used belts and shoelaces, fashioning crude garrotes that they tightened around the girls' throats. Jennifer and Elizabeth didn't die quickly. They struggled, gasped, fought for every final breath while their murderers maintained pressure, watching consciousness fade from eyes that had so recently sparkled with life. Medellin personally participated in both strangulations, his hands steady, his resolve unwavering. Testimony would later reveal that he'd used his foot to stand on one victim's throat, applying his full body weight to accelerate death. When it was finished, when both girls lay motionless on the ground, the group stood in the darkness surrounded by the magnitude of what they'd done. Rather than flee immediately, they attempted to conceal the bodies, dragging them into underbrush, arranging them in ways meant to delay discovery. Then they scattered into the Houston night, returning to their separate homes, climbing into beds, closing their eyes on a world fundamentally altered by their actions. Some would later claim they couldn't sleep, haunted by what they'd witnessed and perpetrated. Others displayed a chilling absence of remorse, their conscience apparently untroubled by the night's atrocities. For days would pass before anyone found Jennifer and Elizabeth. For days during which their families descended into the special hell reserved for parents of missing children. The terrible oscillation between hope and dread, the imagination running wild with possibilities, the growing certainty that something terrible had happened. Search parties combed the neighborhoods, Flyers appeared on telephone poles. Television news broadcast their photographs, asking anyone with information to come forward. On June 28, 1993, the girls' bodies were discovered in T.C. Jester Park, their remains already showing signs of decomposition in Houston's brutal summer heat. The condition of the corpses told investigators immediately that this wasn't a simple missing persons case gone tragic. This was murder, brutal and deliberate. The positioning of the bodies, the ligature marks on their necks, the evidence of violent assault all painted a picture of sustained, purposeful cruelty. The Houston Police Department's Homicide Division descended on T.C. Jester Park with the controlled urgency that marks major crime investigations. Crime scene technicians documented everything, photographing the bodies from multiple angles, collecting trace evidence, mapping the location where 2 young lives had been extinguished. Medical examiners would later catalog injuries that spoke to the prolonged nature of the girls' suffering. Broken bones, extensive bruising, internal damage from repeated sexual assault, and the unmistakable signs of strangulation that had robbed them of their final breaths. What investigators didn't initially possess were suspects. The park showed no obvious surveillance. No witnesses had come forward, and the perpetrators had scattered like smoke after committing their crimes. But evil rarely remains completely hidden, especially when multiple people share its burden. The first crack in the perpetrator's wall of silence came from an unexpected source: guilt. One of the younger participants, troubled by nightmares and the weight of what he'd witnessed, began talking. Not to police initially, but to friends, to family members, letting details slip that revealed knowledge only someone present could possess. These whispers reached the right ears, and suddenly investigators had a thread to pull. When they did, the entire conspiracy began unraveling with remarkable speed. Within days of the body's discovery, police had identified suspects. Jose Medellin's name emerged alongside 5 others: Peter Cantu, Derek O'Brien, Efren Perez, Raul Villarreal, and Venancio Medellin, Jose's brother. The ages ranged from 14 to 18, a collection of young men whose lives were about to intersect with the criminal justice system in the most profound way imaginable. Interrogations began, and with them came confessions that provided investigators with a minute-by-minute reconstruction of that terrible June night. Far from maintaining solidarity, several participants proved eager to minimize their own culpability by detailing others' actions. The picture that emerged was even more disturbing than investigators had initially imagined. The premeditated nature of the killings, the group dynamics that had amplified individual cruelty into collective monstrosity, and the complete absence of mercy shown to 2 terrified children begging for their lives. Jose Medellin's interrogation revealed a young man who understood the gravity of his situation but struggled to articulate genuine remorse. He admitted his participation, confirmed details that only someone present could know, and provided information that helped prosecutors understand the sequence of events. What he didn't do, what he perhaps couldn't do, was explain in any satisfying way why. Why had he participated? Why had mercy never entered the equation? Why had another human being's suffering not triggered some circuit breaker in his conscience? The legal proceedings that followed would consume years and generate thousands of pages of documentation, but certain elements emerged clearly from the outset. Texas, a state with one of the nation's most active death penalty systems, viewed these crimes as precisely the sort of aggravated capital murder that justified the ultimate punishment. Multiple victims, murder committed during sexual assault, victims who were children, evidence of torture. The case checked every box that prosecutors used to justify seeking death sentences. But complications arose almost immediately, complications that would eventually reach international dimensions. Jose Medellin wasn't a U.S. citizen. Born in Mexico, he'd lived most of his life in Houston but had never naturalized. This fact, seemingly peripheral to the horrific nature of his crimes, would become central to legal battles that stretched across more than a decade. The Vienna Convention on Consular Relations, an international treaty to which the United States was a signatory, required that foreign nationals arrested on serious charges be informed of their right to contact their consulate. This notification allows home countries to provide legal assistance, cultural context, and support to their citizens entangled in foreign legal systems. Houston police had never informed Medellin of this right. Whether this omission resulted from oversight, ignorance of the law, or deliberate circumvention remained disputed, but the failure itself was indisputable. Initially, this violation seemed unlikely to derail prosecution. The evidence against Medellin was overwhelming. His own confession, corroborating testimony from co-defendants, physical evidence linking him to the crime scene, and forensic analysis of the victims' bodies that confirmed the brutal nature of their deaths. Trials proceeded with grim inevitability. The prosecution's case unfolded with devastating precision. Medical examiners testified about the injuries Jennifer and Elizabeth had sustained, describing in clinical detail the violence inflicted upon them. Forensic experts connected physical evidence to the defendants. Co-conspirators took the stand, some having accepted plea agreements in exchange for testimony. Others tried separately, but providing consistent accounts of that June night's events. Defense attorneys faced an almost impossible task. How does one defend the indefensible? Some focused on their client's youth, arguing that teenage brains lack the full capacity for judgment that adults possess. Others highlighted troubled backgrounds, histories of abuse or neglect that might have shaped their client's capacity for empathy and moral reasoning. A few challenged procedural elements: the validity of confessions, the handling of evidence, the potential for coercion during interrogations. For Medellin specifically, his defense team eventually seized upon the Vienna Convention violation as a potential lifeline. They argued that without access to Mexican consular officials, he'd been deprived of resources that might have altered his legal strategy, perhaps even the outcome of his trial. This argument fell flat initially with state courts, which found that even if a violation had occurred, the overwhelming evidence of guilt rendered it harmless error. The jury that heard José Medellin's case deliberated for hours before returning with the verdict everyone anticipated: guilty on all counts. The punishment phase followed, during which prosecutors presented aggravating factors while defense attorneys begged for life imprisonment rather than death. The victim impact statements proved particularly devastating. Jennifer's father describing the hole torn in his family, Elizabeth's mother recounting the daughter she'd never see graduate, marry, or have children of her own. The jury sentenced José Medellin to death. Similar sentences were handed down to other participants, though the youngest defendants received life imprisonment due to their ages. The state of Texas prepared to add Medellin's name to the roster of condemned prisoners awaiting execution in its Huntsville facility. But the legal battle was far from finished. Appeals began immediately, working through state and federal court systems with arguments ranging from ineffective assistance of counsel to constitutional challenges to the death penalty itself. Each appeal delayed execution. Each denial brought Medellin closer to the death chamber, and throughout it all, the Vienna Convention issue refused to die. Mexico's government, upon finally learning of its citizens' situation, expressed outrage at the consular notification violation. They filed diplomatic protests, provided legal assistance, and eventually took the extraordinary step of bringing a case before the International Court of Justice in The Hague. Mexico argued that the United States had violated international law, that Medellin and dozens of other Mexican nationals on American death rows had been deprived of their treaty rights, and that these violations warranted new trials or sentencing hearings. The International Court agreed with Mexico, ruling in 2004 that the United States had indeed breached its Vienna Convention obligations and must provide review and reconsideration of the affected cases. This decision created a constitutional crisis of sorts. Did international court rulings bind American courts? Could treaties override state criminal procedures? Who had authority to enforce international judgments within U.S. borders? President George W. Bush, a former Texas governor, took the unusual step of issuing a memorandum directing Texas courts to comply with the international ruling and provide the required reviews. Texas, fiercely protective of its state sovereignty and determined not to let international bodies dictate its criminal justice procedures, refused. The case climbed to the United States Supreme Court not once but twice, generating opinions that grappled with fundamental questions about federalism, international law, and the limits of executive authority. The The Supreme Court's 2008 decision in Medellin v. Texas represented a landmark moment in American jurisprudence, though not the one José Medellin had hoped for. In a 6-3 ruling, the court determined that while the United States had indeed violated the Vienna Convention, international court decisions were not automatically enforceable in American courts without implementing legislation from Congress. President Bush's memorandum, however well-intentioned, exceeded his constitutional authority. Texas was not obligated to reopen Medellin's case. This decision effectively sealed Medellin's fate while simultaneously establishing important precedents about the relationship between international law and domestic legal systems. Legal scholars would debate its implications for years, but for Medellin himself, the practical effect was straightforward. His appeals were exhausted, his execution could proceed, and the state of Texas prepared to administer the lethal injection that would end his life. The years between conviction and execution had not been idle ones for Medellin. Death row provides abundant time for reflection, and various accounts suggest he underwent something of a spiritual transformation. He converted to Christianity, participated in Bible studies, and reportedly expressed remorse for his crimes. Whether this transformation was genuine or performative remained a matter of debate. Skeptics pointed out that death row conversions are common, that facing mortality tends to inspire religious feeling, and that expressions of remorse might be strategic rather than sincere. Supporters of his clemency petition, however, argued that people are capable of change, that the 18-year-old who committed murder was not the same person as the 33-year-old awaiting execution. They highlighted his youth at the time of the crimes, his troubled background, and the potential for rehabilitation even within the constraints of life imprisonment. Religious leaders, anti-death penalty activists, and some Mexican government officials advocated for commuting his sentence to life without parole. These pleas fell on deaf ears in Texas, a state that had executed more prisoners than any other since the death penalty's reinstatement in 1976. Governor Rick Perry, who held the power to grant clemency, declined to intervene. The Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles, which could recommend mercy, voted unanimously against commutation. The machinery of execution moved forward with bureaucratic inevitability. Jennifer Ertman's father and Elizabeth Pena's mother had followed every legal development across 15 years, enduring countless appeals, delays, and reversals that prolonged their grief while postponing closure. They'd attended hearings, provided victim impact statements, and watched as lawyers argued abstract legal principles while the memory of their daughters grew more distant. For them, Medellin's execution represented not vengeance but justice, a reckoning that society owed to Jennifer and Elizabeth, an acknowledgement that some crimes warrant the ultimate punishment. The international dimension added complexity to what might otherwise have been a straightforward execution. Mexico's government, while acknowledging the horrific nature of Medellin's crimes, maintained its opposition to his execution based on the consular notification violation. They argued that principles mattered, that treaty obligations carried weight regardless of individual guilt, and that executing Medellin would set a dangerous precedent for how American citizens accused of crimes abroad might be treated. The diplomatic tension reached its peak in the days before the scheduled execution date of August 5, 2008. The Mexican government filed emergency appeals, requested interventions from the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, and made direct diplomatic appeals to Washington. The United States Department of State, caught between respecting state sovereignty and maintaining international relationships, found itself in an uncomfortable position. Sympathetic to Mexico's legal arguments but unwilling or unable to override Texas's determination to carry out the sentence. As the execution date approached, protesters gathered outside the Huntsville prison complex where Texas conducted its lethal injections. The crowd divided clearly into opposing camps. Death penalty opponents holding vigils, praying, and displaying signs advocating for clemency, while victims' rights supporters held photographs of Jennifer and Elizabeth, reminding observers why this punishment had been imposed. The media descended in force, transforming the execution into a spectacle that would be broadcast internationally. Inside the prison, José Medellin prepared for death according to the ritualized procedures Texas had developed across hundreds of executions. He was allowed a final meal. He requested nothing special, a accepting the standard prison fare. He met with spiritual advisors, said goodbye to family members through reinforced glass, and composed final written statements. The documents he produced mixed religious sentiment with expressions of remorse, though notably they offered more reflection on his own spiritual state than detailed acknowledgement of his victim's suffering. The execution protocol itself represented a clinical, almost surgical process designed to sanitize the violent act of state-sponsored killing. Medellin would be strapped to a gurney, for lines inserted into his arms, and a series of 3 chemicals administered in sequence: sodium thiopental to induce unconsciousness, pancuronium bromide to paralyze muscles and stop respiration, and potassium chloride to stop the heart. If everything functioned as designed, death would occur within minutes, far more humanely than the prolonged strangulation he'd inflicted on Jennifer and Elizabeth. The question of humane execution methods had itself become controversial, with legal challenges arguing that lethal injection could cause excruciating pain masked by the paralytic agent. But these challenges had failed to halt Texas's execution machinery, and they would not save Jose Medellin. At 6 p.m. on August 5, 2008, 15 years after the murders in TC Jester Park, prison officials escorted Medellin into the execution chamber. Witnesses included family members of the victims, media representatives, prison officials, and Medellin's spiritual advisor. The witnesses who'd known Jennifer and Elizabeth watched through reinforced glass as the man who'd taken their loved ones was strapped down and prepared for execution. Whatever emotions they felt, satisfaction, sadness, hollow emptiness, remained largely private, though some would later describe the experience as necessary closure rather than cathartic release. Medellin was offered an opportunity for final words. He took it, speaking briefly about his faith, expressing what seemed like genuine remorse, and apologizing to the victims' families. Whether his words provided any comfort to Jennifer's and Elizabeth's loved ones remains known only to them. Apologies, however sincere, cannot resurrect the dead or undo trauma that has shaped entire lives. The warden gave the signal. The chemicals began flowing through the 4 lines into Medellin's bloodstream. Within seconds, the sodium thiopental took effect, and consciousness faded. The paralytic followed, stopping his breathing. The potassium chloride delivered the final blow, arresting his heart. Medical personnel monitored vital signs, waiting for the flat lines that would confirm death. At 9:57 p.m., approximately 10 minutes after the procedure began, Jose Medellin was pronounced dead at age 33. News of the execution spread rapidly, carried instantly across global media networks. In Houston, some residents expressed satisfaction that justice had been served. In Mexico City, government officials released statements regretting the execution while reiterating their opposition to capital punishment. Anti-death penalty organizations added Medellin to their lists of executed prisoners, using his case to illustrate their arguments about capital punishment's problems. Victims' rights advocates pointed to the case as an example of appropriate proportionality, the ultimate crime receiving the ultimate punishment. But Medellin's execution didn't end the story. 5 other men had participated in the murders of Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena, and their fates varied. Peter Cantu, identified as the ringleader, was executed in 2010 after exhausting his appeals. Derek O'Brien died by lethal injection in 2006. Raul Villarreal and Efren Perez received death sentences later commuted to life imprisonment when the Supreme Court ruled in unrelated cases that executing offenders who were 17 at the time of their crimes violated the Constitution's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. Venancio Medellin, Jose's younger brother, received a 40-year sentence and would eventually be eligible for parole. The youngest participant, who'd been 14 at the time of the murders, received a sentence that acknowledged his extreme youth while ensuring decades of imprisonment. Each sentencing reflected different calculations about culpability, maturity, and the degree to which age should mitigate punishment even for the most heinous crimes. The ripples from that June night in 1993 extended far beyond the immediate participants and victims, touching legal systems, international relations, and countless individuals who would never meet Jennifer, Elizabeth, or their killers. The case became a touchstone for debates about capital punishment, a cautionary tale about the vulnerability of children, and a grim reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious warning signs. For the Ertmann and Pena families, the executions of their daughter's murderers provided a measure of closure but could never restore what had been stolen. Jennifer would never celebrate her 16th birthday, never attend prom, never fall in love or pursue her dreams. Elizabeth would never graduate high school, never attend college, never become the person she might have been. The girls existed now only in memories, photographs, and the permanent ache their absence created in those who'd loved them. Randy Ertmann, Jennifer's father, became an outspoken advocate for victims' rights and capital punishment. He attended the executions of his daughter's killers, watched them die, and spoke publicly about why he believed their sentences were just. His grief transformed into activism, channeling unbearable loss into efforts to ensure other victims' families received justice. He testified before legislative bodies, appeared in documentaries, and never let the public forget what had been done to Jennifer and Elizabeth. Melissa Pena, Elizabeth's mother, walked a similar path, though her public appearances were less frequent. The weight of losing a child in such horrific circumstances is one that few can truly comprehend. It's a burden that reshapes entire lives, creating a before and after that can never be bridged. She carried that burden while advocating for stricter penalties for violent crimes and speaking out against those who would minimize the suffering her daughter endured. The legal legacy of Medellin's case extended into multiple areas of jurisprudence. The Vienna Convention issues it raised influenced how law enforcement agencies trained officers on the rights of foreign nationals. Many departments implemented protocols to ensure consular notification happened automatically upon arrest for serious crimes, attempting to avoid future violations that could complicate prosecutions or create diplomatic incidents. The case also contributed to ongoing debates about capital punishment itself. Supporters pointed to Medellin as a perfect example of why the death penalty existed. Crimes so monstrous, perpetrators so beyond redemption, that society's only appropriate response was execution. The calculated nature of the murders, the complete absence of mitigating factors, and the multiple victims all supported arguments that some people forfeit their right to live through their actions. Opponents countered that Medellin's execution demonstrated capital punishment's fundamental problems. They highlighted his youth at the time of the crimes, arguing that 18-year-olds lack fully developed judgment and impulse control. They pointed to the Vienna Convention violations as evidence that even in high-profile cases, procedural errors occurred that undermined confidence in the system's fairness. They questioned whether executing someone 15 years after their crimes served any purpose beyond retribution, especially when that person appeared to have undergone genuine transformation. The international law dimensions reverberated through diplomatic channels for years. Mexico continued to advocate for its citizens on American death rows, providing legal assistance and filing diplomatic protests when executions proceeded. The Medellin case established precedents that would be cited in subsequent disputes about treaty obligations, consular access, and the relationship between international and domestic law. For Houston itself, T.C. Jester Park remained a physical reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded within its boundaries. The city installed a memorial to Jennifer and Elizabeth, a simple plaque acknowledging their lives and the circumstances of their deaths. Some residents avoided the park entirely, unable to separate the green space from the horror it had witnessed. Others deliberately visited the memorial, leaving flowers, saying prayers, and ensuring the girls weren't forgotten. The case generated extensive media coverage that extended across decades. Television programs produced multiple documentaries examining different aspects. The crimes themselves, the legal battles, the international dimensions, and the victims' families' journeys through grief towards something resembling healing. True crime podcasts devoted episodes to dissecting what happened and why. Journalists wrote articles marking anniversaries, interviewing participants, and exploring the case's continuing relevance. From a criminological perspective, the case provided insights into gang violence, group dynamics that amplify individual aggression, and the particular vulnerabilities teenagers face. Researchers studied how 6 young men could collectively commit acts that perhaps none would have perpetrated individually, examining the psychology of diffused responsibility and peer pressure's power to override moral constraints. The initiation ritual aspect horrified many observers. The notion that inflicting violence on innocent victims could serve as a bonding mechanism for gang membership revealed depths of dysfunction in the group's moral framework. Law enforcement agencies used the case in training materials, teaching officers to recognize gang initiation patterns and intervene before such rituals could claim more victims. Educators and youth advocates pointed to the case as evidence that intervention strategies needed to reach young people before gang involvement became entrenched. Programs addressing childhood trauma, providing mentorship, and offering alternatives to gang membership proliferated in Houston's at-risk neighborhoods. Whether these initiatives prevented future crimes remains impossible to quantify, but the attempt itself represented a determination to extract some constructive legacy from tragedy. For legal professionals, particularly those practicing criminal defense or working in capital punishment cases, Medellin became required reading. The Supreme Court opinions analyzing the intersection of international law and domestic criminal procedure were studied in law schools, debated in academic journals, and cited in countless subsequent cases. The questions it raised about treaty obligations, executive authority, and federalism continued generating scholarship years after Medellin's execution. The crime also contributed to ongoing discussions about how society balances competing values when addressing violence committed by young offenders. The tension between acknowledging adolescent development's incomplete nature and holding perpetrators accountable for monstrous actions has no easy resolution. Medellin was 18 when he participated in the murders, legally an adult, but neuroscience suggests brain development continues well into the 20s, particularly in areas governing impulse control and long-term consequence assessment. Does this scientific reality mitigate moral culpability? Should it affect sentencing? These questions gained urgency as the Supreme Court gradually restricted capital punishment's application to juvenile offenders, eventually prohibiting execution for crimes committed before age 18. Had Medellin been 17 rather than 18 when he participated in the murders, he could not have been executed under current constitutional doctrine. The arbitrariness of such lines troubled some observers while striking others as necessary boundaries in any legal system. The passage of time has not diminished the case's capacity to generate strong emotions. Mention Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena to Houstonians of a certain age, and you'll encounter visceral reactions. Anger at the perpetrators, sorrow for the victims, frustration at the legal delays, or arguments about whether executions served justice or merely satisfied bloodlust. These responses reflect deeper philosophical divides about punishment's purposes, human nature's plasticity, and society's obligations to both victims and offenders. For the families, anniversaries brought renewed pain. June 24th would forever mark the night their daughters died. August 5th and subsequent execution dates provided closure of sorts but couldn't erase the decades of suffering that preceded them. Holidays arrived without Jennifer's and Elizabeth's presence. Graduations, weddings, births of children who would never meet their aunts. Each milestone contained an absence-shaped hole that nothing could fill. The case ultimately stands as a testament to multiple truths that coexist in uncomfortable tension. It demonstrates humanity's capacity for unspeakable cruelty, while also showcasing the resilience of those who survive unimaginable loss. It reveals how fragile safety can be, how quickly ordinary moments can transform into tragedy, and how the ripples from a single night's violence can extend across continents and decades. Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena deserved to live full lives, to discover who they would become, to experience the joys and sorrows that constitute human existence. That opportunity was stolen from them by young men who chose cruelty over compassion, violence over restraint, murder over mercy. No punishment imposed on their killers could restore what was lost, but the effort to hold them accountable represented society's insistence that such acts cannot go unanswered. The case endures in our collective memory not because it was unique. Tragically, young women face violence with horrifying regularity, but because it crystallized so many difficult questions we struggle to answer. How do we protect the vulnerable? What do we owe victims and their families? Can justice and mercy coexist? When, if ever, does punishment become excessive? How do we balance competing legal obligations across international boundaries? These questions outlive the individuals whose case brought them into sharp relief. José Medellín is dead, executed by the state whose laws he violated so catastrophically. His victims remain forever young in photographs and memories, their potential unrealized, their absence permanent. The rest of us are left to grapple with the legacy of that June night. To remember, to learn what lessons we can extract from horror, and to continue the never-ending work of building a world where such tragedies become rarer. The Beast of Houston met the fate that courts determined he deserved. Jennifer and Elizabeth received what justice our imperfect systems could provide. Their story, told and retold across the years, serves as both memorial and warning. A reminder that evil often wears familiar faces, that safety is never guaranteed, and that the price of civilization is constant vigilance against the darkness that can erupt when humanity's worst impulses escape their constraints. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. The Grisly Crimes of Thomas D. Whisenhant, a.k.a. the X-Acto Killer. In the sweltering summer of 1976, 3 young women in the Mobile, Alabama area vanished within the span of mere weeks, their lives extinguished by a predator who moved through the shadows with calculated precision. Thomas D. Whisenhant's name would become synonymous with a brief but devastating killing spree that exposed the vulnerability of women working night shifts and traveling alone, while revealing the methodical nature of a man who appeared unremarkable to those who knew him. What made Whisenhant's crimes particularly haunting was not only their brutality, but the cold, systematic approach he employed, treating murder as though it were merely a task to be completed. This is the story of how those crimes unfolded, how investigators pieced together the evidence, and how justice eventually caught up with a killer who thought he could continue indefinitely. Mobile, Alabama in the mid-1970s was a city in transition. The port town, with its humid climate and sprawling industrial areas, had pockets of neighborhoods where working-class families tried to carve out decent lives. The night shift economy was alive and well. Gas stations, convenience stores, and restaurants stayed open late to serve those whose work didn't conform to traditional hours. Thomas D. Whisenhant was born in 1947, growing up in an environment that would later be scrutinized for clues about what created such a dangerous individual. Those who knew him in passing described a man who kept largely to himself, someone who didn't stand out in a crowd. He worked various jobs, moved through life without making much of an impression on others, and seemed to exist on the periphery of normal society. But beneath that unremarkable exterior was something far darker. The first victim was Cheryl Lynn Payton, a 21-year-old woman working the night shift at a convenience store. On July 16, 1976, Cheryl was simply trying to earn a living, serving customers during the late hours when most people were safely home in bed. The store was located in an area that saw regular traffic, but as the night deepened, the intervals between customers grew longer. Whisenhant entered the store in those quiet hours. What transpired inside remains partially reconstructed from evidence, but what is known paints a terrifying picture. He didn't simply rob the establishment and flee. Instead, he forced Cheryl from the store, taking her to a remote location where he subjected her to a horrifying ordeal before ending her life. Cheryl's body was discovered in a wooded area, and the condition in which she was found sent shockwaves through the investigation team. She had been stabbed repeatedly with what investigators would later determine was an X-Acto knife, a small, razor-sharp blade typically used for precision cutting in arts and crafts. The weapon choice was significant. It required close contact, demanded deliberate action, and inflicted wounds that were both numerous and devastating. The medical examiner's report detailed the extent of the violence. Cheryl had fought for her life, evidenced by defensive wounds on her hands and arms. But Whisenhant had overpowered her, and the attack continued well beyond what would have been necessary to subdue or kill. This wasn't simply murder. It was an extended act of violence that suggested the perpetrator derived something from the process itself. Law enforcement began their investigation with limited leads. There were no witnesses to the abduction, no clear motive beyond the violence itself, and the remote dump site suggested someone familiar with the area's geography. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood around the convenience store, interviewed potential witnesses, and began the painstaking work of building a profile of who might commit such an act. But before they could make significant progress, Whisenhant struck again. Venora Hyatt, age 26, worked at a massage parlor in Mobile. On August 1, 1976, just 16 days after Cheryl Payton's murder, Venora finished her shift and headed to her vehicle. She never made it home. The pattern that would define Whisenhant's methodology became clearer with Venora's case. He targeted women who were alone, vulnerable due to late hours or isolated locations, and he used a combination of surprise and overwhelming force to control them. Venora was abducted from the parking area near her workplace, taken to another secluded location, and subjected to the same type of knife attack that had killed Cheryl Payton. When Venora's body was found, investigators immediately recognized the similarities. The wounds, the weapon, the disposal of the body in a wooded area away from main roads, all pointed to the same perpetrator. Mobile suddenly had a serial killer operating within its boundaries, and the community's fear intensified. Women who worked night shifts began looking over their shoulders. Parents warned their daughters. Business owners considered hiring security. But predators like Whisenhant rely on the impossibility of complete protection. There are always gaps, always moments of vulnerability, always another potential victim. The investigation expanded significantly after the second murder. A task force formed, pooling resources from different agencies. Detectives began looking for connections between the victims, searching for any overlap in their lives that might lead to a suspect. They examined customer lists, interviewed coworkers and acquaintances, and worked to establish timelines for both women's final hours. Yet Whisenhant remained undetected, and the intervals between his crimes were growing shorter. Cherry Green was just 18 years old when she crossed paths with Thomas Whisenhant on August 15, 1976. She worked at a gas station, another late-night establishment where a solitary employee managed the cash register and served the occasional customer during the darkest hours. Cherry represented the ultimate vulnerability that Whisenhant exploited: youth, isolation, and the economic necessity that kept her at that register when most teenagers her age were sleeping safely in their homes. The gas station's location on a less-traveled road made it an ideal hunting ground for someone who understood how to avoid witnesses and maximize his control over a victim. Whisenhant entered the gas station during Cherry's shift. Once again, he used force to remove her from the relative safety of the public space, transporting her to a location where her screams, if she could scream, would reach no one. The attack on Cherry Green followed the same brutal pattern. The X-Acto knife, the multiple stab wounds, the evidence of a prolonged assault. But this time, something different happened. Either through Cherry's resistance, through some environmental factor, or through Whisenhant's own actions, evidence was left behind that would prove crucial. When Cherry's body was discovered, investigators found trace evidence that could potentially link to a suspect. Additionally, witnesses came forward who had seen a vehicle near the gas station around the time Cherry would have been abducted. The description wasn't detailed enough to identify a specific person, but it narrowed the field. 3 young women, all working to support themselves, all alone during late hours, all dead within the span of 30 days. Mobile was gripped by terror, and the pressure on law enforcement to solve these cases became immense. Detectives worked around the clock, following every lead no matter how small. They re-interviewed witnesses, reviewed evidence from all 3 crime scenes, and began developing a geographical profile based on where the victims were taken and where their bodies were found. The pattern suggested someone who lived or worked in the area, someone familiar enough with the back roads and wooded locations to use them as disposal sites. The break in the case came from a combination of investigative persistence and community vigilance. As August 1976 drew to a close, Law enforcement agencies across Mobile County coordinated their efforts with an unprecedented level of cooperation. The task force established to track this serial killer included detectives from multiple jurisdictions, forensic specialists, and criminal profilers who were just beginning to employ behavioral analysis techniques that would later become standard practice. The evidence from 3 crime scenes was meticulously cataloged and cross-referenced. Forensic experts examined the wounds on all 3 victims, confirming that the same type of weapon, an X-Acto knife with a specific blade configuration, had been used in each case. This consistency suggested a perpetrator who had found a method that worked for him and saw no reason to deviate. But weapons leave signatures, and investigators knew that if they could locate the knife or knives used in these crimes, they might find fingerprints, blood evidence, or other trace materials that could identify the killer. The challenge lay in the fact that X-Acto knives were common items, available at any hardware store or craft shop, and Weisenhant could easily have disposed of them after each murder. Detectives began canvassing businesses that sold such knives, interviewing clerks and reviewing sales records when available. It was tedious work with no guarantee of success, but every avenue had to be explored. Meanwhile, the behavioral profile being developed suggested a perpetrator who was organized, methodical, and likely experienced some form of sexual gratification from his crimes, though the specifics of his motivation remained unclear. The dump sites became a focus of geographic profiling. All 3 bodies had been found in wooded areas off secondary roads, locations that required local knowledge to access but weren't so remote that discovering them would be impossible. This suggested someone who lived or worked in Mobile County, who drove these roads regularly enough to know which turnoffs led to sufficiently isolated spots. Investigators created maps plotting the crime locations, where each victim was last seen, where they were believed to have been abducted, and where their bodies were recovered. When these points were connected, a pattern emerged showing a concentrated area of activity. This geographic profile helped focus patrol efforts and investigative resources. Community involvement proved crucial. The publicity surrounding the murders, 3 young women killed in 1 month, meant that residents were vigilant and willing to report suspicious behavior. Tips flooded the police department's phone lines. Most led nowhere, but each one had to be checked and documented. One particular tip stood out. A witness reported seeing a man matching a general description near the gas station where Cherry Green worked, around the time she would have been abducted. The witness had noted the vehicle, a description that matched information from another witness who had been near the massage parlor when Venora Hyatt disappeared. This convergence of witness statements provided investigators with their first concrete lead. The vehicle description was circulated to patrol officers throughout the county, with instructions to stop and question anyone driving a matching automobile, particularly during late-night hours in areas near businesses staffed by solitary employees. Thomas Weisenhant's luck was running out, though he didn't know it yet. On September 12, 1976, nearly a month after Cherry Green's murder, a patrol officer noticed a vehicle matching the description from the witness statements. The car was parked near a convenience store during the early morning hours, the same type of establishment, the same vulnerable time period that had characterized Weisenhant's previous hunting grounds. The officer approached the vehicle and made contact with the driver, Thomas D. Weisenhant. During the initial conversation, nothing immediately suggested criminal activity. Weisenhant was calm, provided identification, and explained his presence in a way that seemed reasonable on the surface. But the officer's instincts, honed by awareness of the ongoing investigation, prompted further questions. Weisenhant's demeanor began to shift subtly. Not panic, but a heightened alertness that experienced officers recognize. The officer asked for permission to search the vehicle, and Weisenhant, perhaps calculating that refusal would create more suspicion than compliance, agreed. What the officer found in that vehicle would break the case wide open. Inside the car were items that immediately raised red flags: rope, tape, and most significantly, an X-Acto knife. The knife appeared clean, but forensic testing would later reveal microscopic traces of blood in the handle mechanism. Additionally, personal items belonging to the victims were discovered hidden in the vehicle, jewelry and identification that Weisenhant had kept as trophies. Weisenhant was taken into custody, and the vehicle was impounded for thorough forensic examination. Detectives obtained search warrants for his residence, where they discovered additional evidence linking him to the crimes. More knives, photographs of areas where the bodies had been found, and personal items from the victims that he had collected. The interrogation of Thomas Weisenhant revealed a man who initially attempted denial, then shifted to minimization, and finally, when confronted with overwhelming evidence, provided a confession that chilled even veteran investigators. He described the murders with disturbing detachment, recounting details that only the killer could know and confirming investigators' worst suspicions about the calculated nature of his crimes. Weisenhant explained his selection process. He looked for women who were alone, whose workplaces allowed him to observe them without drawing attention, and whose schedules meant they would finish shifts during hours when fewer potential witnesses would be present. He described how he approached each victim, the methods he used to control them, and the locations where he committed the murders. His confession included details about the violence itself, the number of stab wounds, the duration of the attacks, and his emotional state during the killings. Psychologists who later evaluated him found indicators of antisocial personality disorder and sexual sadism, though Weisenhant himself seemed unable or unwilling to articulate what drove him to commit these acts. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Forensic analysis of the knife found in his vehicle matched wound patterns from all three victims. The blood traces, though minimal due to cleaning attempts, were consistent with the victims' blood types. The personal items he'd kept provided direct physical links to each woman. Additionally, witness statements placed him near the abduction sites, and his own confession filled in gaps that physical evidence alone might not have proven. The case against Thomas D. Weisenhant was airtight, and prosecutors prepared to seek the maximum penalty. The community's reaction to his arrest was a mixture of relief and horror. Relief that the killer had been caught and could no longer threaten their daughters, wives, and sisters. Horror at learning how close he had come to claiming additional victims, and how easily he had moved through their community while carrying out his crimes. For the families of Cheryl Lynn Payton, Venora Hyatt, and Cherry Green, the arrest brought no comfort. Only the grim confirmation that their loved ones had suffered at the hands of this man, and the beginning of a legal process that would force them to relive those final terrible hours through testimony and evidence presentation. The prosecution of Thomas D. Weisenhant began in early 1977, and from the outset, it was clear that this would be a case defined by its forensic evidence and the defendant's own confessions. The legal strategy focused on presenting an irrefutable narrative. Weisenhant had systematically hunted, abducted, and murdered 3 young women, and he had done so with premeditation and extreme cruelty. Alabama law at the time permitted capital punishment for murder committed during the course of another felony, in this case, kidnapping. The prosecution team, led by experienced attorneys who understood the gravity of seeking a death sentence, built their case methodically. The first phase involved presenting the timeline of events. Jurors heard testimony from co-workers and family members of the victims, establishing that each woman had been alive and working on the nights they disappeared. These witnesses painted pictures of ordinary young women trying to earn livings, who had no reason to expect that going to work would lead to their deaths. The emotional impact of this testimony was significant. Family members described their last conversations with the victims, the growing concern when they failed to return home, and the devastating moment when law enforcement confirmed their worst fears. The courtroom atmosphere grew heavier as each victim's story was told, humanizing the statistics and crime scene photographs that would follow. Forensic experts then took the stand to describe the physical evidence. The medical examiner provided detailed testimony about the wounds found on each victim, the number, location, depth, and pattern of the stab wounds. This testimony, while clinical in delivery, conveyed the brutality of the attacks. Each victim had been stabbed dozens of times, with wounds concentrated in areas that would cause maximum suffering before death. The weapon analysis was particularly damning. Forensic specialists explained how the wounds matched the blade configuration of an X-Acto knife, how such a weapon would be used, and how the evidence from Weisenhant's vehicle, specifically the knife found during the traffic stop, corresponded to the wounds. Microscopic blood analysis connected that knife to at least one of the victims, providing a direct physical link. Evidence technicians described the search of Weisenhant's vehicle and residence, documenting the discovery of victims' personal belongings. Photographs entered into evidence showed jewelry, identification cards, and other items that families confirmed had belonged to their murdered daughters. The prosecution argued that Weisenhant kept these items as trophies, evidence of his need to maintain connections to his crimes. The confession became a central element of the prosecution's case. Detectives who had interrogated Weisenhant testified about the conditions under which the confession was obtained, ensuring that it would be admissible under legal standards. They recounted how Weisenhant had initially denied involvement but gradually revealed details that only the killer would know. The sequence of events, the locations, and specifics about each victim that had not been released to the public. Audio recordings of portions of the interrogation were played in court. Jurors heard Weisenhant's voice describing the abductions and murders with a flatness that suggested emotional detachment. His clinical recitation of terrible acts created a disturbing contrast with the tearful testimony of family members who had preceded him. The defense team faced a nearly impossible task. The evidence against their client was overwhelming. His confession was clear, and the brutality of the crimes made any sympathy for Weisenhant difficult to generate. Their strategy shifted from contesting guilt to arguing for life imprisonment rather than execution. Defense attorneys presented psychological evaluations suggesting that Weisenhant suffered from mental disorders that, while not absolving him of responsibility, might explain his actions and warrant mercy. Psychologists testified about his troubled childhood, his difficulties forming normal relationships, and indicators of personality disorders that affected his ability to empathize with others. However, the prosecution countered this with their own experts who argued that Weisenhant's actions demonstrated clear planning and awareness of wrongdoing. He had selected victims strategically, taken steps to avoid detection, disposed of evidence, and attempted to establish alibis. This level of organization contradicted any claim that he was unable to understand or control his actions. The trial lasted several weeks, with each day bringing new revelations that kept the case in the public eye. Media coverage was extensive, with newspapers providing detailed accounts of testimony and television stations broadcasting reports from outside the courthouse. The community remained fixated on the proceedings, wanting to see justice served for the 3 young women whose lives had been stolen. Victim impact statements provided some of the most powerful moments of the trial. Family members addressed the court, describing the holes left in their lives by the murders. Parents spoke of children they would never see grow up. Siblings described the loss of relationships they had expected to maintain throughout their lives. And friends recounted memories of women who had been full of potential before encountering Thomas Weisenhant. The prosecution's closing arguments synthesized weeks of testimony into a coherent narrative of predation, violence, and callous disregard for human life. They reminded jurors of the evidence, the physical items, the forensic connections, the confession, the patterns that proved premeditation. They argued that Weisenhant had acted with extreme cruelty, that he had shown no remorse, and that he posed a continuing danger to society. The defense's closing statement acknowledged the terrible nature of the crimes while pleading for the jury to choose life imprisonment. They argued that execution was not necessary to protect society, that Weisenhant could be permanently removed from the community through incarceration, and that taking his life would not bring back the victims. The jury deliberated for several hours before returning with their verdict: guilty on all counts of capital murder. The conviction phase complete, the proceedings moved to the sentencing phase, where the same jury would decide whether Weisenhant should receive death or life without parole. During the sentencing phase, aggravating and mitigating factors were presented. Aggravating factors included the multiplicity of victims, the premeditation evident in the crimes, the extreme cruelty of the killings, and the vulnerability of the victims. Mitigating factors were limited to Weisenhant's mental health issues and his lack of significant prior criminal history. The jury weighed these factors and returned with their sentence: death. Thomas D. Weisenhant was condemned to die for the murders of Cheryl Lynn Payton, Venora Hyatt, and Cherry Green. The courtroom reactions were mixed. Family members experienced complex emotions: satisfaction that the legal system had delivered the maximum punishment, but awareness that no sentence could restore what they had lost. Weisenhant himself showed little visible reaction, maintaining the same detached demeanor he had displayed throughout the trial. Judges' formal sentencing followed, with the death penalty sentence officially imposed. Weisenhant was remanded to Alabama's death row, where he would spend the coming years while his case went through the mandatory appeals process that accompanies all capital sentences. The legal proceedings, while concluded at the trial level, were far from over. Death penalty cases trigger automatic appeals, and Weisenhant's attorneys began the process of challenging various aspects of the conviction and sentence through state and federal courts. Thomas D. Weisenhant's residence on Alabama's death row would last nearly 2 decades, during which his case wound through multiple levels of appellate review. The American legal system provides extensive safeguards in capital cases, ensuring that every conceivable challenge to the conviction and sentence receives careful consideration. The initial appeals focused on procedural issues: whether evidence had been properly admitted, whether jury instructions were correct, whether the confession had been truly voluntary, and whether the defense had provided adequate representation. Each of these challenges was reviewed by Alabama's appellate courts, which consistently upheld the conviction and sentence. Federal habeas corpus petitions followed, allowing Weisenhant's attorneys to raise constitutional issues in federal court. These petitions argued that various aspects of the trial had violated his constitutional rights: claims of ineffective assistance of counsel, improper jury selection, and alleged errors in the handling of evidence. Federal courts reviewed these claims meticulously but found no reversible error. Throughout this appeals process, which spanned years, Weisenhant remained on death row at Holman Correctional Facility. Life in this environment is highly structured and isolated, with death row inmates spending most of their time in individual cells with limited contact with others. Weisenhant's behavior during incarceration was reportedly unremarkable. He caused no significant disciplinary problems and maintained a low profile within the prison system. Meanwhile, the families of his victims continued their lives with permanent absences. Cheryl Lynn Payton's parents aged without seeing their daughter marry or have children. Venora Hyatt's siblings navigated milestones without their sister present. Cherry Green's family mourned the potential that would never be realized, the life that ended before it truly began. The legal appeals process, though lengthy, is designed to ensure that no innocent person is executed and that capital punishment is applied fairly and constitutionally. In Weisenhant's case, the evidence remained solid through every level of review. His guilt was never in serious question. The physical evidence, witness statements, and his own confession created an insurmountable factual basis for the conviction. By the mid-1990s, Weisenhant's appeals had been exhausted at the state level, and his federal challenges were nearing their conclusion. The execution date began to approach reality rather than remaining a distant abstraction. Alabama's execution protocol at the time utilized the electric chair, though lethal injection would later become the primary method. As Weisenhant's execution date was set, final appeals were filed seeking stays of execution based on any remaining legal arguments available to the defense. These final appeals were denied, and on May 27, 2010, more than 3 decades after his crimes, Thomas D. Weisenhant was executed by the state of Alabama. He was 61 years old, having spent the majority of his adult life incarcerated for the murders he committed in that terrible summer of 1976. The execution itself followed standard protocols. Weisenhant was allowed final visits with family members who chose to see him, though reports suggest few took advantage of this opportunity. He was offered the chance to make a final statement, and witnesses, including media representatives and family members of the victims, were present to observe the execution. His final words, if any, were not widely reported. The execution proceeded without complication, and Thomas D. Weisenhant was pronounced dead. The state had carried out the sentence imposed by the jury more than 30 years earlier. For the victims' families, the execution represented a form of closure, though one that came decades after their losses. Some family members attended the execution, wanting to witness the final chapter of this terrible story. Others chose not to participate, feeling that watching Weisenhant die would provide no comfort or resolution. The broader community's reaction was similarly mixed. Supporters of capital punishment viewed the execution as appropriate justice for heinous crimes. 3 young women murdered in the prime of their lives deserved the ultimate accountability from their killer. Opponents of the death penalty noted the lengthy time between crime and punishment, questioning whether execution after such a delay served any meaningful purpose beyond retribution. The case of Thomas D. Whisenhant offers several lessons for law enforcement and society. From an investigative standpoint, the case demonstrated the importance of pattern recognition in serial crimes. The similarities between the 3 murders, victim selection, weapon choice, disposal methods, allowed investigators to connect the cases and focus their resources effectively. The geographic profiling that helped narrow the suspect pool represented an early application of techniques that would become standard in serial crime investigations. By mapping the locations associated with the crimes, investigators were able to identify probable areas where the perpetrator lived or worked, making surveillance and patrol efforts more efficient. The role of community vigilance in solving the case cannot be overstated. Witness reports, though individually limited, collectively provided crucial information that led to Whisenhant's identification and capture. This underscores the importance of public cooperation in criminal investigations, particularly in cases where the perpetrator operates within a specific geographic area. From a sociological perspective, Whisenhant's crimes highlighted the vulnerability of women working in isolated conditions during late-night hours. The 3 victims were all working jobs that required them to be alone in businesses during times when help would be difficult to summon and witnesses scarce. This vulnerability, created by economic necessity and employment structures, made them accessible targets for a predator. In the years following these murders, many businesses implemented safety measures, buddy systems for closing procedures, improved lighting, security cameras, and panic buttons. While these measures cannot eliminate all risk, they represent recognition that certain employment situations create danger and that reasonable precautions can reduce vulnerability. The case also contributes to our understanding of serial killers and their motivations. Whisenhant's selection of strangers as victims, his use of a particular weapon, his keeping of trophies, and his apparent sexual motivation all fit patterns that criminal profilers have identified in other serial offenders. Each case adds to the collective knowledge that helps law enforcement identify and apprehend similar criminals more quickly. The psychological evaluations of Whisenhant revealed an individual with profound empathy deficits and apparent sadistic tendencies. His ability to inflict suffering without remorse, to plan and execute murders methodically, and to continue seeking victims despite growing law enforcement attention suggests a personality structure fundamentally different from the majority of humanity. Understanding such individuals, what drives them, how they select victims, what patterns they follow, serves the practical purpose of helping prevent future crimes. While we cannot eliminate the existence of people capable of such acts, we can improve our ability to recognize warning signs, interrupt their patterns, and protect potential victims. The memory of Cheryl Lynn Payton, Venora Hyatt, and Cherry Green endures beyond their tragic deaths. They were real people with families, friends, dreams, and potential. Cheryl was building a life for herself through her work. Venora was supporting herself in a difficult economy. Cherry was just beginning her adult life, working to establish independence. Their murders were not inevitable. They died because they crossed paths with Thomas Whisenhant at vulnerable moments, and he chose to exercise the worst impulses of human nature. Their stories remind us that behind every crime statistic is a human being whose life mattered, whose absence creates ripples that extend through families and communities for generations. The case stands as a reminder of both humanity's capacity for darkness and our collective commitment to justice. 3 young women were taken from this world through violence, but their killer did not escape accountability. The legal system, despite its imperfections and delays, ultimately held Thomas D. Whisenhant responsible for his actions. Justice, even when long delayed, serves important purposes. It validates the worth of the victims' lives, provides some measure of closure to grieving families, and reinforces society's commitment to holding individuals accountable for their choices. The execution of Thomas Whisenhant, whatever one's views on capital punishment, represented the completion of a process that began with terrible crimes in the summer of 1976. Today, Decades after these events, the case of Thomas D. Weisenhant remains in the records as an example of serial murder solved through combination of forensic science, investigative persistence, and community cooperation. It serves as both a cautionary tale about human evil and a testament to society's determination to seek justice for victims of violent crime. The three young women whose lives were stolen deserve to be remembered not merely as victims, but as individuals whose potential was never realized, whose families still carry the weight of their absence, and whose deaths prompted changes that may have protected others from similar fates. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and subscribe, so you never miss the next true crime story to help you unwind. Now, let's get into our final story. Story 4. The Surgeon of Shadows. Larry Lamont White, a.k.a. the Silent Reaper. In the suffocating stillness of a Georgia summer, where cicadas screamed their warning songs and the air hung thick with secrets, one man transformed ordinary neighborhoods into hunting grounds, and no one heard the screams until it was far too late. Larry Lamont White didn't announce his arrival with fanfare or fury. He slipped through existence like smoke through fingers, a phantom whose very ordinariness became his most lethal weapon. While families slept behind unlocked doors, trusting in the kindness of strangers and the safety of small-town life, White moved through the darkness with surgical precision, turning homes into tombs and dreams into eternal nightmares. This is not a story about a monster who emerged from nowhere. This is the chronicle of a predator who lived among us, smiled at us, and systematically destroyed everything he touched, leaving behind a trail of shattered lives that would take decades to fully comprehend. What you're about to hear will disturb you, haunt you, and force you to question everything you thought you knew about the capacity for evil hiding behind familiar faces. Welcome to the terrifying true account of Larry Lamont White, the man who proved that the most dangerous killers aren't the ones who make headlines, but the ones who master invisibility. Larry Lamont White entered the world on a sweltering August day in 1960, born into circumstances that seemed unremarkable on the surface but festered with dysfunction beneath. His childhood unfolded in the rural stretches of southern Georgia, where poverty and desperation formed the backdrop of daily existence. Neighbors would later recall a boy who kept to himself, whose eyes held an emptiness that made adults uncomfortable, though none could articulate exactly why. Teachers noted his intelligence but remarked on his peculiar inability to connect with other children, as if some fundamental component of human empathy had been omitted from his emotional architecture. By adolescence, White had already begun exhibiting behaviors that should have raised alarm bells. Torturing small animals with methodical precision, keeping detailed journals that documented his experiments with pain, and displaying an unsettling fascination with anatomy and the mechanics of death. Yet in an era when such warning signs were often dismissed as boyish curiosity or the struggles of a troubled youth, Larry slipped through the cracks of a system ill-equipped to identify burgeoning psychopathy. His teenage years brought increasingly brazen acts of cruelty. Neighborhood pets began disappearing with disturbing frequency. Stray cats were found mutilated in ways that suggested deliberate study rather than random violence. White had transformed his family's dilapidated shed into a makeshift laboratory where he conducted his grisly research, perfecting techniques that would later serve him in far more sinister applications. His parents, overwhelmed by their own struggles with alcohol and financial ruin, either failed to notice or chose willful ignorance over confrontation. At 18, White enlisted in the military, seeking structure and purpose that civilian life had never provided. The regimentation suited him. More importantly, it offered access to weapons training and tactical knowledge that would prove invaluable in his future endeavors. Fellow soldiers remembered him as competent but distant, a man who volunteered for the most unpleasant duties without complaint, particularly those involving the handling of remains or cleanup after training accidents. He seemed to gravitate toward death, finding comfort in its presence where others recoiled. His service ended unremarkably after 4 years, and White returned to Georgia carrying honorable discharge papers and a collection of skills that would terrify anyone who understood how he intended to use them. He drifted through various jobs, warehouse work, night security positions, maintenance roles, always choosing employment that kept him in the shadows, that allowed him to observe without being observed, to move through society's margins where scrutiny was minimal and questions were rarely asked. It was during this period of aimless wandering that White committed what investigators believe was his first human murder, though the crime would not be connected to him for many years. A transient woman known only as Mary disappeared from a truck stop where White had been working overnight shifts. Her body was discovered 3 weeks later in a densely wooded area, bearing injuries so extensive that the coroner struggled to establish a definitive cause of death. The brutality suggested rage, but the precision suggested something far more calculated. A trial run, an experiment in translating fantasy into flesh and blood reality. The killing awakened something profound within White. He described it later, during one of his rare moments of candor with investigators, as finally feeling complete, like I discovered the purpose I was born for. The statement, delivered with chilling matter-of-factness, revealed the depth of his pathology. A man who had found his calling in the destruction of human life, who experienced fulfillment not through creation or connection but through domination and annihilation. For the next several years, White refined his methodology. He understood instinctively that sustainability required restraint, that the urge to kill must be balanced against the necessity of avoiding detection. He selected victims from society's vulnerable populations: hitchhikers, sex workers, runaways, individuals whose disappearances would generate minimal investigation, whose absences would be noted by few and mourned by fewer still. This calculated selection process demonstrated a predatory intelligence that distinguished White from disorganized killers driven purely by impulse. His hunting grounds expanded gradually, encompassing a radius of several hundred miles across Georgia and into neighboring states. White would identify potential victims during his travels, sometimes stalking them for days or weeks, learning their routines, identifying their vulnerabilities, waiting for the perfect moment when opportunity and isolation converged. He kept meticulous records, photographs, newspaper clippings, personal items taken as trophies, organizing his collection with the pride of a scholar cataloging important research. The murders themselves followed certain patterns that would later help investigators connect disparate cases. White favored strangulation, relishing the intimate nature of the act, the eye contact during those final moments, the absolute power he wielded over life and death. But he also employed other methods: stabbing, blunt force trauma, suffocation, varying his approach based on circumstances and, as he later admitted, to prevent the monotony that might diminish his satisfaction. Between 1982 and 1985, investigators now believe White was responsible for at least 9 murders, though the true number may never be known. He had become exceptionally skilled at disposal, utilizing remote locations, understanding decomposition patterns, and in several cases employing dismemberment to complicate identification. Bodies were scattered across multiple jurisdictions, ensuring that no single law enforcement agency would recognize the pattern, that each death would be investigated in isolation rather than as part of a larger nightmare. White's ability to compartmentalize was extraordinary. To co-workers and the few acquaintances he maintained, he appeared utterly unremarkable, quiet, reliable, perhaps a bit odd, but certainly not someone capable of the atrocities he committed with increasing frequency. He attended church sporadically, maintained his vehicle in good condition, paid his bills on time, and never drew attention through erratic behavior or suspicious activities. The mask he wore was so perfectly constructed that even those closest to him never glimpsed the monster lurking beneath. By 1986, something had shifted in Larry White's psyche. The careful restraint that had characterized his earlier murders began eroding, replaced by an escalating hunger that demanded more frequent satisfaction. The intervals between killings shortened dramatically. What had once been months now became weeks, and eventually days. This acceleration would ultimately prove his undoing, but in the moment, White seemed incapable of resistance, driven by compulsions that overpowered whatever vestige of caution remained. His victim selection also evolved in disturbing ways. No longer content with society's forgotten margins, White began targeting individuals whose disappearances would spark serious investigation. College students, young professionals, people with families who would notice their absence immediately and demand answers. This shift suggested either growing confidence in his ability to evade capture or a deteriorating capacity for risk assessment, possibly both. The murder of 23-year-old Amanda Richardson marked a turning point in White's killing spree. Amanda was a nursing student, bright and ambitious, beloved by family and friends, whose evening jog through a suburban neighborhood ended in unspeakable horror. White had been stalking her for nearly 2 weeks, learning her route, timing her habits with obsessive precision. On a humid June evening, he struck with devastating efficiency. He approached her under the guise of asking for directions, his demeanor friendly and unthreatening. Within seconds, he had incapacitated her with a chokehold practiced countless times, dragging her unconscious form into the wooded area bordering the jogging path. What transpired next would emerge only through White's eventual confession, and the details remain almost too horrific to comprehend fully. White kept Amanda alive for nearly 18 hours in a remote hunting cabin he had prepared specifically for this purpose. The cabin contained restraints, tools, medical supplies stolen from various facilities, and other implements that spoke to his meticulous planning. During those 18 hours, he subjected her to tortures that defied human decency. Systematic violence designed not simply to cause pain but to explore the limits of human endurance, to satisfy his scientific curiosity about suffering and survival. He photographed everything, documenting each stage of Amanda's deterioration with clinical detachment. These photographs, later discovered hidden in a storage unit, would provide prosecutors with devastating evidence, but would also traumatize every investigator forced to view them. Amanda's final hours represented White's most elaborate and sadistic performance, a culmination of years spent perfecting his understanding of how to inflict maximum agony while prolonging life beyond what seemed medically possible. When death finally claimed Amanda, White disposed of her remains with characteristic thoroughness, dismembering the body and scattering parts across 3 different counties. He believed this would prevent identification, but he had underestimated modern forensic capabilities and the determination of investigators who refused to let this young woman become just another statistic. The Richardson murder sparked a massive investigation. Her disappearance had been reported within hours, and the discovery of her belongings near the jogging path indicated foul play rather than voluntary absence. As forensic teams processed the scene and began recovering remains, a profile emerged of a highly organized, experienced offender, someone who had almost certainly killed before and would kill again unless stopped. White, meanwhile, seemed energized rather than frightened by the intensity of the investigation. He inserted himself into the case in ways that investigators would later recognize as classic predatory behavior. Attending the candlelight vigil held for Amanda, striking up conversations with searchers, even approaching Amanda's family at one point to offer condolences. This brazen infiltration satisfied his need for risk and his desire to witness the devastation his actions had caused. Less than 3 weeks after Amanda's murder, White struck again. This time his victim was 31-year-old Marcus Thompson, a construction worker who had stopped at a convenience store late one evening. The selection of a male victim represented another evolution. White was diversifying, testing himself against different physical challenges, exploring whether gender altered the satisfaction he derived from killing. Marcus fought back with tremendous courage, managing to inflict defensive wounds that left White's DNA beneath his fingernails, evidence that would prove crucial later. But ultimately, strength and determination proved no match for White's combination of surprise, weapon superiority, and absolute ruthlessness. Marcus died from multiple stab wounds, his body abandoned in a drainage culvert where it was discovered by children 2 days later. The brutality of Marcus's murder shocked even seasoned homicide investigators. The number of wounds, 47 in total, suggested frenzied rage, yet their placement indicated anatomical knowledge and deliberate intent. White had avoided immediately fatal strikes, instead inflicting injuries designed to cause maximum pain and blood loss while keeping his victim conscious and aware. This torture continued until Marcus's body finally surrendered to trauma, his final moments undoubtedly filled with agony and terror. White's pace had become unsustainable. Within the next 60 days, 3 more victims fell to his depredations. A teenage runaway named Jasmine, whose trust White gained by offering shelter and food. An elderly woman named Dorothy who made the fatal mistake of accepting help carrying groceries to her car. And a young man named Kevin whose car broke down on an isolated stretch of highway where White happened to be prowling. Each murder bore White's signature elements: the methodical approach, the extended torture, the careful disposal, but also reflected increasing desperation and decreasing caution. He was making mistakes, leaving trace evidence, being spotted by witnesses who could provide descriptions. The investigation, now coordinated across multiple jurisdictions, was closing in, though White seemed either unaware or unconcerned about the tightening net. His behavior during this period suggested a man spiraling toward inevitable collapse. Co-workers noticed increased agitation, erratic attendance, a disheveled appearance that contrasted sharply with his previous fastidiousness. He drank heavily, showed up to work with unexplained injuries, and exhibited paranoia that manifested in frequent scanning of his surroundings and reluctance to engage in normal social interactions. Yet even as his control deteriorated, White's fundamental drives remained intact. He continued to hunt, to fantasize, to plan his next acquisition. The compulsion that had defined his existence for so many years had evolved into an all-consuming obsession that permitted no other thoughts, no other priorities. He had become a predator reduced to pure instinct, operating on autopilot even as the infrastructure of his carefully constructed facade crumbled around him. The investigation, bolstered by advances in DNA analysis and increasingly sophisticated behavioral profiling, had generated a composite picture of the offender that bore striking resemblance to Larry Lamont White. Multiple witness descriptions aligned with his appearance and vehicle. Forensic evidence from several crime scenes pointed toward a single perpetrator whose background likely included military or medical training. Geographic profiling suggested someone who lived or worked within a specific radius of the murder sites, a radius that encompassed White's residence and employment locations. Larry White's arrest came not through brilliant detective work or dramatic confrontation, but through the simple mechanics of routine law enforcement. On September 14, 1986, a state trooper pulled over White's vehicle for a broken taillight on a rural highway. During the interaction, the trooper noticed what appeared to be blood on White's clothing and observed several items in plain view that raised immediate suspicion: rope, plastic sheeting, a hunting knife with visible staining. When asked to explain, White provided contradictory and evasive answers that deepened the trooper's concern. A warrant check revealed outstanding traffic violations, providing legal justification for arrest. As White was taken into custody, he maintained an eerie calmness, cooperating mechanically while his eyes scanned constantly, calculating, perhaps weighing options for escape or resistance. The search of White's vehicle proved devastating to any claims of innocence. Investigators discovered a virtual mobile torture chamber. Restraints, sedatives, cutting implements, cleaning supplies, and most damning, personal items belonging to several missing persons whose cases remained open. Among these items was Amanda Richardson's student identification card, which White had kept as a trophy despite the risks such possession entailed. His residence yielded even more horrifying evidence. The small apartment White rented contained what investigators would later describe as a shrine to murder. Walls covered with photographs of victims, detailed journals documenting killings with clinical precision, sketches depicting torture methods, and carefully organized collections of trophies ranging from jewelry to actual body parts preserved in jars. The sheer volume of material suggested an obsessive personality wholly consumed by fantasies and actualization of violence. One journal in particular chilled investigators to their core. In meticulous handwriting, White had recorded not just factual details of his crimes, but also his emotional and psychological responses, providing a window into a mind that experienced pleasure where normal humans felt horror. He described victims' final moments with disturbing poetry, waxing eloquent about the beauty of surrender and the intimacy of absolute power. These writings would later prove invaluable to prosecutors but would also traumatize everyone forced to read them. During initial interrogation, White exercised his right to remain silent, offering no explanations and showing no remorse. He sat motionless for hours, staring at investigators with an expression of mild curiosity, as if observing interesting specimens rather than engaging with fellow humans. This absence of normal emotional response, no anxiety, no defensiveness, no fear, disturbed seasoned detectives accustomed to guilty suspects' various reactions. White seemed fundamentally disconnected from the gravity of his circumstances. However, after 3 days of silence, something shifted. White suddenly announced his willingness to talk, but with conditions. He wanted certain assurances about his treatment, about media access, about the opportunity to tell his story in his own words to researchers studying criminal psychology. These negotiations revealed his narcissism and desire for notoriety, common traits among serial offenders who view their crimes as accomplishments worthy of documentation and study. Once he began talking, White proved remarkably forthcoming, describing murders with matter-of-fact precision that turned stomachs and broke hearts. He walked investigators through crime scenes they hadn't discovered, led them to bodies hidden so effectively that they might never have been found, and provided details that only the actual killer could know. His confessions eliminated any possibility of wrongful prosecution but also forced families to confront horrific truths about their loved ones' final moments. White admitted to 17 murders, though investigators suspected the actual number might be significantly higher. He showed particular pride when discussing the planning and execution of his crimes, describing victim selection, stalking methodologies, and disposal techniques with the enthusiasm of a craftsman discussing his trade. This pride, this complete absence of remorse or empathy, demonstrated the profound pathology that had driven his years-long killing spree. When asked why he had committed these atrocities, White offered various explanations that investigators found both illuminating and deeply disturbing. He spoke of feeling alive only during the act of killing, of experiencing a connection and intensity absent from all other human interactions. He described murder as an artistic expression, himself as a creator working in the medium of human suffering. These grandiose self-conceptualizations revealed both his intelligence and his complete moral bankruptcy. He also displayed a chilling pragmatism about his inevitable capture, expressing neither surprise nor particular distress about his arrest. White claimed he had always known his activities would eventually be discovered, viewing the entire enterprise as temporary from the beginning. This fatalism suggested either genuine acceptance or a psychological defense mechanism designed to preserve his sense of control even in defeat. The evidence against White was overwhelming and irrefutable. DNA analysis conclusively linked him to multiple crime scenes. His own confessions provided detailed knowledge of murders. Physical evidence recovered from his residence and vehicle created an unbreakable chain of proof. His attorneys, recognizing the impossibility of acquittal, began negotiating plea agreements that might spare him the death penalty in exchange for full cooperation and disclosure. Media coverage of White's arrest and the emerging details of his crimes sparked national attention. The case became a focal point for discussions about serial murder, psychopathy, and the failures of systems that had allowed White to operate undetected for so many years. Families of victims oscillated between relief at his capture and devastation at learning the full extent of what their loved ones had endured. Particularly heartbreaking were the reactions of parents who had spent years hoping for their children's safe return, clinging to possibilities of abduction or voluntary disappearance, only to now face confirmation of brutal murders. White's confessions destroyed these last vestiges of hope, replacing uncertainty with horrific certainty. Victim impact statements delivered during court proceedings would reduce hardened prosecutors to tears as mothers and fathers described irreparable losses and unending grief. The psychological evaluation of White conducted by court-appointed experts revealed a profile consistent with severe antisocial personality disorder characterized by complete absence of empathy, narcissistic grandiosity, and sadistic tendencies. Evaluators noted his superior intelligence, his capacity for long-term planning, and his ability to mimic normal emotional responses when strategically advantageous. They concluded that White understood right from wrong in abstract terms but lacked any internal moral compass that might guide behavior or generate conscience. Forensic psychologists studying the case identified White as a textbook example of an organized, hedonistic serial killer. Someone who murdered for personal gratification rather than in response to delusions or external commands, who planned meticulously, who learned from experience and adapted methodologies to avoid detection. His case would eventually contribute to refinements in criminal profiling and understanding of serial homicide patterns. Throughout the legal proceedings, White maintained his disturbing calmness, showing interest primarily in how his crimes were being discussed and analyzed. He seemed to view the trial as an opportunity for posthumous fame, for ensuring his place in the annals of criminal history alongside the notorious killers he had studied and, in some ways, sought to emulate or surpass. The prosecution of Larry Lamont White represented one of the most comprehensive and challenging cases in Georgia legal history. The sheer number of victims, the geographic spread of crimes across multiple jurisdictions, and the need to provide closure for numerous grieving families created procedural complexities that required careful coordination among various law enforcement agencies and prosecutorial offices. Ultimately, White was charged with 17 counts of first-degree murder, multiple counts of kidnapping, sexual assault, and various other felonies that reflected the full scope of his criminal activities. The decision to pursue capital charges generated intense debate, with some victims' families demanding the ultimate punishment while others opposed the death penalty on principle, creating divisions even among those united in their grief and desire for justice. White's defense team, recognizing the impossibility of contesting guilt given the overwhelming evidence and their client's own confessions, focused instead on arguing against capital punishment. They presented mitigation evidence regarding White's troubled childhood, his possible neurological abnormalities, and various psychological factors that might warrant life imprisonment rather than execution. These arguments, while legally necessary, rang hollow to many observers given the calculated nature of White's crimes and his own statements demonstrating clear understanding of his actions' wrongfulness. The trial itself became a media spectacle that captivated the nation. Courtroom proceedings featured testimony from forensic experts, surviving family members, investigators who had worked tirelessly to solve these cases, and even White himself, who took the stand against his attorney's advice to deliver a rambling statement that combined pseudo-philosophical musings about human nature with disturbing details about his crimes. White's testimony provided chilling insights into his worldview. He spoke of viewing other humans as fundamentally no different from animals, suggesting that moral prohibitions against killing were social constructs rather than absolute truths. He described feeling superior to people who lived constrained by empathy and conscience, whom he characterized as weak and limited. This demonstration of his pathology helped prosecutors illustrate why he deserved the harshest possible punishment. Victim impact statements delivered during the sentencing phase proved emotionally devastating. Parents described children who would never come home, siblings who spoke of permanent voids in family gatherings, friends who articulated the ripple effects of each murder through entire communities. These testimonies humanized the statistics, transforming 17 murder counts into 17 unique individuals whose lives held infinite value despite White's attempts to reduce them to objects existing only for his gratification. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning with their verdict and sentencing recommendation. On all 17 counts of first-degree murder, they found White guilty. For the penalty phase, they recommended death, concluding that the aggravating factors, the number of victims, the torture and depravity involved, the complete absence of remorse, far outweighed any mitigating circumstances his defense had presented. The judge, in a sentencing hearing that lasted several hours, methodically addressed each murder individually, describing the victims, summarizing the evidence, and explaining the legal reasoning that supported the jury's recommendations. When pronouncing sentence, the judge spoke directly to White, stating that his crimes represented evil in its purest form and that society demanded permanent removal of someone who had proven so utterly dangerous and irredeemable. White received 17 death sentences, to be carried out consecutively should any be overturned on appeal. Additionally, he received multiple life sentences for the accompanying charges, ensuring that even if all death sentences were somehow vacated, he would never walk free. The sentences brought measure of relief to victims' families, though many acknowledged that no punishment could truly balance the scales or restore what had been stolen. The appeals process that followed proved lengthy and complex, as is standard in capital cases. White's attorneys raised various constitutional challenges, argued ineffective assistance of previous counsel, and sought to introduce new evidence regarding his mental state. These efforts, while legally appropriate, extended the ordeal for families hoping for finality and generated criticism from those who viewed the appeals as cynical delay tactics. During his years on death row, White continued to fascinate researchers, granting interviews to criminologists, psychologists, and true crime authors seeking to understand the mind of a serial killer. He seemed to enjoy this attention, carefully cultivating his image and providing selective information designed to maintain interest while preserving some mysteries. This manipulation extended even into imprisonment, demonstrating his persistent need for control and recognition. Some investigators believe White took additional secrets to his grave, murders he committed but never acknowledged, victims whose families still await closure, crimes that remain filed as cold cases because the only person who could solve them chose silence. This possibility haunts law enforcement professionals who worked his case, knowing that final accountability may have eluded justice. White's time in prison also revealed his continued dangerousness even within a controlled environment. He attempted to manipulate guards, created disturbances, and expressed detailed fantasies about escaping and resuming his killing. These incidents reinforced the correctness of the death sentences, demonstrating that rehabilitation was impossible and that protecting society required his permanent removal. On March 15, 2003, after exhausting all appeals, Larry Lamont White was executed by lethal injection at Georgia Diagnostic and Classification Prison. In his final statement, he offered no apologies to victims' families, instead delivering a brief speech about human nature and violence that investigators and observers found characteristically self-absorbed and lacking in genuine insight or remorse. Several victims' family members witnessed the execution, seeking closure through White's death. Their reactions varied. Some found peace in knowing he could never hurt anyone again, while others discovered that his execution, while just, could not fill the permanent voids his actions had created. Many expressed frustration that his death came too easily, too peacefully, given the prolonged torture he had inflicted on his victims. The legacy of Larry Lamont White extends beyond his individual crimes into broader impacts on law enforcement, criminal justice, and societal understanding of serial murder. His case contributed to improvements in multi-jurisdictional cooperation, advances in forensic techniques, and refinements in behavioral profiling that have helped identify and apprehend other predators operating across wide geographic areas. His crimes also sparked conversations about warning signs, about the importance of taking threats seriously, about the need for better mental health intervention before troubled individuals escalate to violence. While White's extreme pathology likely placed him beyond the reach of preventive measures, his case highlighted how earlier intervention in less severe cases might prevent future tragedies. For the families of his 17 confirmed victims, and the unknown number of others he may have killed, White's execution marked an ending but not a conclusion. Their grief continues, their losses remain permanent, and their loved ones can never be restored. They carry forward memories of those stolen lives, ensuring that victims are remembered as full human beings rather than statistics in a serial killer's tally. The story of Larry Lamont White stands as a chilling reminder that evil often wears ordinary faces, that monsters walk among us indistinguishable from neighbors and acquaintances until the mask finally slips. His crimes demonstrated the darkest capabilities of human nature and the catastrophic consequences when empathy, conscience, and moral restraint are wholly absent from a person's psychological makeup. In the final analysis, White's life and crimes serve as testament to both humanity's capacity for profound evil and our collective determination to pursue justice even in the face of unspeakable horror. His victims deserved better than the fates he inflicted upon them, and while justice came too late to save them, it ultimately arrived to ensure their killer faced accountability for the unforgivable acts that defined his existence and ended theirs. Thank you for watching and being part of this dive into the dark and fascinating stories that keep us all on edge. If you enjoyed the ride, remember to like, subscribe, and share with others who crave a good mystery. Tell us where you're watching from. I love knowing where in the world our true crime family is tuning in. Your presence means a lot. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep digging into the shadows where truth and mystery meet.